Okay, I see it's 6:01 p.m. Central, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. And as a reminder, I'll let participants in as they join. But I wanted to have plenty of time for our speakers who are with us today and introduce you to Rachel Ledezma. She's Director of Pupil Services at Greendale School District, and also Denise Burnett, Program Support Specialist and Co-Director of Time for Learning Charter School, also from the Greendale School District. And that's in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, if anyone is interested. I am based in Jackson, Mississippi, so that's a little bit further away from me. I'm a member of the Wiedemann-Steiner Syndrome Foundation, and so happy to have this session today where we're talking about tips and tools for navigating the IEP process. This is a very important topic for many of our families, and I know it's one that is scary to navigate for the first time or even the 10th time. And so we're just so appreciative of both of our speakers being with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Rachel and let her tell a little bit more about herself, and we'll just get going. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Crystal. Well, we're super excited to have this opportunity this afternoon to share around our tips and tools for navigating the IEP process. So a little bit about me. This is actually a synopsis of my bio in a nutshell. I'm a committed educator, a lifelong learner, and advocate for the underserved and historically marginalized. Professionally, I have served as a special education teacher, a coordinator of special education and pupil services, and currently, as Crystal shared, a director of special education and pupil services for a school district in southeastern Wisconsin. I also serve as a board member for a nonprofit that supports people with disabilities, and the focus of that work for that nonprofit is around community inclusion and meaningful work for people who are 18 and beyond. And then personally, I like to kind of share this because it speaks to my positionality and what I bring to the work. I personally have a significant visual impairment, and I grew up with a father who is legally blind. So that shaped the person I am today, and it impacts my approach to how I serve others and do this work in special education. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-facilitator and allow her to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Denise Burnett. I also work for the Greendale School District with Rachel, so I'm excited to be here as well. So a little bit about me. I also am a lifelong learner and an instructional coach. I have the 4K director role in our school district as well, which is part of our charter school within our school district. As far as what I do, I was a special ed teacher for quite a long time. I've worked with students from early childhood age through 9th grade, so I've had the opportunity to teach at all grade levels through 9th grade. And then currently I'm a program support specialist. So I'm able to support special education teachers across all 3 of our elementary schools, along with our early childhood programming and in 4K. Personally, I do have a sister with an intellectual disability. She clearly has driven me to be the educator that I am, and I'm lucky to have her. And I think she's really helped me to make a positive impact on families because while I don't have a child with a disability, she is 8 years younger than I am, and one day I'll be her guardian. So I just have a different perspective than many special education teachers. And I think that just helps me to build relationships with families and have just a bit of a different understanding than others. So again, I'm excited to be here tonight.
And I can definitely attest to that, as Denise and I work very, very closely together. So with that being said, I'm sorry, I'm just getting a message here. I'm gonna say later. So I hope that doesn't cause a problem and it doesn't impact my audio or anything like that. So what we're hoping for tonight is that everyone will walk away with a better understanding of the key parts of the IEP and how that may impact your child's education. We're hoping to share some effective tips for preparing for that annual IEP, we're assuming that everyone here has been through that initial evaluation process and that their child has an IEP, and that's how we've tailored the information this afternoon. We also want to share some thoughts around how to advocate for your child's strengths, needs, and goals in the IEP, and then sharing some tips around communication methods to help you all as parents build connections with case managers, service providers, and your school district. We always hope that disputes and conflicts don't arise, but sometimes they do. So we want to share a little bit around how to navigate that if it comes up. All right. Before we dig in too deep, we wanted to share this disclaimer is that, again, we're sharing those tips and tools. However, if you have a specific situation that you are dealing with, we would encourage you to, number one, work with your district, but number two, if you need to, seek an advocate or someone who is knowledgeable about the process and your child's need to help you navigate that. We are in southeastern Wisconsin, so much of the information we will share tonight is really specific to our state's expectations for procedures and guidance within the state. We recognize that every state may have slightly different statutes or administrative guidelines, but that level set, being the federal IDEA law, is kind of the rule of the land, right? And then within that, states have specific information. So do your research, talk to your district so that the information you receive tonight, you can apply to your own situation and your child's situation. And then above all, we really believe in that collective capacity building. That's something that we pride ourselves in our district around, is engaging our families and partnering with them. So collaborate with your teachers, service providers, and school districts whenever possible, because that will result in quality services for your child and your child getting what they need when they need it so that they can succeed. So with that, we're going to hop right in. We wanted to really ground ourselves in what guides special education, and it's really a couple of things. So number one, it is a federal legislation, IDEA, which makes available a free, appropriate, and public education to children with disabilities when it comes to special education and related services. And then that is the fence, so to speak, right? And then within the fence, there's this opportunity for each individual state to pass its own statute to embed that legislation into state law, as well as provide instruction to public school districts. So we just shared the statute from our state, and then our PI 11, which really kind of defines special education and lays out some of that guidance. So it's pretty much the same framework in every state, that federal legislation, state statute, and then some procedural guidance. One other thing that makes up special education is case law. And oftentimes that case law actually comes as a result of parents like yourselves advocating for their children. Unfortunately, sometimes it gets to a due process level where it has to go through the courts. We hope that it never gets there, and that's why we always encourage that collaboration, but sometimes it does. This is an example of that, the Andrew F. standard, where there was a young man, a student with autism, and his parents ended up suing the school district because they felt like he was not making the progress that he needed to make. This ended up being a landmark Supreme Court decision, and it has been the standard since 2017. It extended the Raleigh standard, which was basically a student needs to make progress. This defined it more, and it said that a student needed to make reasonable progress more than de minimis progress in light of that child's circumstances. So the combination of federal law, legislation, state statute, procedures and guidance, and case law, as well as advocacy from parents like you, have shaped special education and what it is today. So we just wanted to start with that grounding. With that being said, one other key principle is the least restrictive environment principle. And really what this is it's a belief system. It is not a specific place. It changes based on each student's individual needs. So we wanted to just highlight that as well. One thing that we're expecting is that every school district and every child that is receiving special education has access to a continuum of special education services. And this is what it looks like in our district. So with the principle of least restrictive environment, it starts by making sure that that student has an opportunity to be included in their classroom with their peers. And that may shift or may be different for every student, but that is the starting point and that is the basis. So just want to share that every school district should have a continuum of special education services. This is what it looks like in our district. Also note that on the bottom, the arrow is kind of pointing both ways, and it's to indicate the least restrictive environment as a belief system, as a principle, changes based on that student's individual needs. All right, so I think I'm at your point. Not quite yet. So what is an IEP? So an IEP is actually a program of services for a specific student. It should be individualized, and it is definitely a legal commitment of resources. So what that means is that oftentimes at the IEP meeting, and we'll talk about who those team members are, at that meeting, there should be somebody that can make that legal commitment of services, saying that this is what we're going to be providing for this child. And that's why we have this opportunity to, if something arises, there's a process starting with your school district, but all the way up to due process. And as we saw with the Andrew F. standard, the possibility of it going to a Supreme Court. So it's a legal commitment of resources. And it's a tool to measure the child's progress. So we're putting down in writing exactly what that student's needs are, exactly what services that child should be receiving, how we're going to monitor progress, when we're going to monitor progress. And then the other key component is that it can only really be changed by a child's IEP team. So sometimes I might receive a phone call from a parent that has concerns, and I'm definitely going to listen to that parent's concerns and work to resolve the concerns. But at the same time, I'm respecting that team decision-making process, because I wasn't at the IEP team meeting, right? That parent was there, the special education teacher was there, perhaps a service provider and an LEA. And that team came together with the expertise and the knowledge about that child, taking all the information collectively and making a decision about what that service looks like. So all IEP decisions are made in the context of an IEP team. All right, so who are the required members? We're gonna start with those required members, and then know that after we have those required members set, we can oftentimes add additional team members in. So at a minimum, on an IEP team, there must be you as a parent or a legal guardian. There must be a regular education teacher, and the role of that regular education teacher is to really not give information as far as how that student is progressing, have input into those IEP team decisions, but also really be able to speak to what is the general education curriculum? What do general education environments look like? And how do we ensure that students have access to those? The special education teacher or service provider is there to speak specifically to special education, how we make adaptations, lead the IEP process for the team. And then the LEA representative is that person who is making that legal commitment of resources. Sometimes we also add on other additional team members. So if a student is 14 or older, we may add in a transition agency. In our district for our high schoolers, we typically invite a DVR representative from the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation to sit and be part of that team as we think about what will life look like post-secondary after students leave high school, and how do we put services in place to ensure that that is a successful transition and bridge to life after high school. And then we want to make sure that people on this team are knowledgeable as far as like what that data is saying, being able to interpret evaluation results and present them at a meeting. So these are the required team members for any IEP. Tips to prepare for the IEP. So we wanted to just share some thoughts and some things to consider as you've either went through the IEP process this year already, it may still be coming up, and even things to think about for next year. So we recognize that oftentimes in education, we do a lot of education speak. We try not to, we try to make sure that we don't use lots of acronyms and things that are just known kind of in our field. So what we would encourage any parent to do is sometimes in those meetings, it's lots of information being shared. Their language may be different. It may be a sensitive topic that you're talking about. So just writing down your concerns in advance when you have, the presence of mind and you're not kind of in the midst of a meeting, taking in all that stimuli to just get those thoughts down in advance and share them if you're able. So in our districts, oftentimes our case managers will reach out with a survey to collect information around parent concerns and things that they would like to talk about at the IEP meeting. Sometimes they'll even get those things into a draft of the IEP. So it's there when we get to the actual IEP table to talk through it. Consider if you want to bring someone along with you. So that might be someone with knowledge and expertise about your child. That would always be the goal. We're there to make student-centered decisions. So we will want you to consider bringing somebody who knows your child really well, who can help advocate on behalf of your child. So that could be a family friend. It could be another parent who has been through that special education process and who can help support the team. Sometimes families in our state, we have what we call Wisconsin facets, and they oftentimes offer advocates up for families. So we will sometimes have advocates attend the meetings. As a parent, you have that right to bring whomever you would like to the meeting. We typically encourage that. The only time that we may need to consider, kind of who that is if it's an actual attorney like representing you. But outside of that, we would encourage you to bring someone along. Reviewing the IEP. So sometimes you may have reviewed that IEP a year ago. You talk to your case managers all the time. You know what services your child's receiving, but maybe you haven't sat down and actually read the IEP since the last IEP meeting. So just reviewing the IEP, making notes about things that you think are your child's needs, and perhaps even services or goals you will want written into that IEP. Keeping in mind that it's a team decision, but this is about you preparing for that process. And then above all, share your input. We want to hear what you have to say. We firmly in our school district believe in dual capacity building. So as school professionals, we have expertise and knowledge, but at the same time, we recognize that you are the parent and you are your child's first teacher, and you have lots to teach us and lots of information to offer. So please share that information during the meeting. Ask questions. We want to make sure that everybody understands what's going on in the meeting. They have an opportunity for input so that as we arrive at those decisions, we have consensus around those decisions. And then we'll talk about this at the end, but just making sure that when you get that finalized paperwork, that is your prior written notice. So it is notice to say that these are the services we've committed. These are your child's goals that we'll be working on. This is the data that we use to determine that because you have an opportunity, if you have not received that prior written notice, to kind of come back to the district and ask for that. So just reviewing it when they send it to you before the IEP is implemented. And then always know that you can request a review revise. So you've had your annual IEP meeting, you've reached out to your case manager. After that meeting, you've shared concerns, you're feeling like, we really need to address this, you can request a review revise meeting when needed. So that's just something to know. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it on to Denise, and she's going to take us through some of the key parts of the IEP.
I'm going to just jump back to that review revise for just a moment. I was talking to a parent today, and they were just concerned that they couldn't ask for a review revise. And I was like, you know what, that's your right. And in some cases, we're having review revise meetings every set number of weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Sometimes it's after a behavior issue has come up. So just remember, as parents, you have that right to ask for that review revise. And our obligation from a district perspective is to meet, because that's what we need to do, because we need to come back to that consensus as far as what we feel is in the best interest of the child. All right, so we can go on to the next one, Rachel. So as many of you know, you've experienced the IEP process. We just want to give a little bit more detail on the parts of it. Feel free to put any questions in the chat. We're happy to answer those. So that first part is the strengths. And in our district, as Rachel had mentioned, we do send home a survey or a parent perspective, and we really want to hear from families. What do you think your child's strengths are? And then from a district perspective, we want to add those in as well. So we will definitely put all of those strengths in there. And then Rachel, I'll have you go back just to that slide. So then that next part is present levels. So that's where you should be seeing information just, regarding what is your child currently doing now. We're looking at that academic area, and then we're looking at that functioning. Special factors, we'll talk about that page. The effects of the disability, we'll give you a little bit more information on that. In our district, we've made some great steps in really thinking about how to best write these for students. And then parent concerns, that's something that's so important for you to share about. So think about really trying to prepare that list ahead of time. I know that when I first started teaching, which was over 20 years ago, we would just ask parents at the meeting, well, what are you concerned about? And parents wouldn't always have that answer. So giving parents time to think about that and to really think like, what is it? What are my hopes for my child? What is it that I'm thinking about now, or as they transition to a new school or a new grade level? And just thinking about what is it that I want the school district to know. Then that family engagement piece is also so important, as what can we do to help families engage in the education of their children. We'll talk a bit more about goals and then those services. Rachel will touch on those a bit more coming up. And then that placement, where is the team deciding that that student should be placed? All right, we can go on to that next slide. So in Wisconsin, we are using the College and Career Ready IEP 5-step process. So we've been providing PD to our staff so that everyone has a clear understanding of what this looks like. So step one, again, is that understanding of the present levels of performance, and we'll talk more about that academic and functional performance. Step two is to identify the effects of the disability and the disability-related needs. Again, this is that heart of that IEP. This really tells us what is the area of concern and where do we want this student to grow. Then step three is to develop those annual goals based on the disability-related needs that the team wrote. Step four is to think about that specially designed instruction. So what type of instruction does your child need in order to meet the goals that we've written? And then step five, we are always wanting to think about that analysis towards the goal. So your staff should be doing progress monitoring and thinking about the progress that's being made. And if for some reason adequate progress isn't being made, a review revise meeting can always be held to be looking at that, but that team should be thinking about what could we do differently to help see that progress. All right, we can go on to the next slide. So as I said, present levels really looks at two areas, and then depending on the age of the child, it breaks down even a little bit more. So for that first section, in Wisconsin, we're looking at academic achievement, and I imagine that most of you in the states that you reside in are looking at that same thing. So we're looking at those content areas, and then we're looking, and that's for reading, math, science, social studies for students that are in kindergarten through high school. Then for students that are in early childhood, so our 3- and 4-year-olds, really there we're looking at that early language development, communication, early literacy, cognition, and then just general knowledge. So as students go into kindergarten, then that shifts a little bit to looking more at those academic contents. So we really want to think also about what is the progress that we are looking at for typically developing peers and those standards. And we want to make sure that we are sharing that with families to show what is expected of students of a certain age and then where their child is currently functioning. So in our school district, we are using FastBridge. So this would be an example of talking about what the national percentages are for students on certain assessments that we're giving or screeners that we're giving, and then showing where that child is currently functioning. And that would be the same too if your child was on an alternate assessment, that same information could be showed in that case too. Then when we look at functional performance, we want to look at those everyday living things such as school, work, and play, their habits, their health, social and emotional skills. And we're looking at the social and emotional competencies, which is really driving what are students being asked to do at certain grade levels, and then what skills are we seeing in that child, and then just really talking about those. When we think about the functional performance, we want to, again, look, just as I said, what are students doing at that age? And then where is that student currently functioning? So that's really the breakdown of those two areas. Of course, if your child receives speech and language, that information will be in there. Occupational and fine motor, if there's a sensory concern, visual impairment, anything like that, that'll either fall into that academic achievement area or that functional performance, depending on where that service provider feels that it's most appropriate. All right, Rachel, we can go on. Then the next part of the IEP are the special factors. And this is very important because it really helps us to really look at that child. And by the way we answer these questions, it helps us to really determine what services or what things need to be considered in the IEP itself. So that first part looks at behavior, excuse me, and we're looking at the positive behavioral interventions and supports that children need. So if we say yes, that a child has a behavior need, then we're going to want to make sure that we document that in the supplemental aid and service portion of the IEP. In the same behavior area, we're then asking the question, is this a child that requires a functional behavior assessment as well as a behavior intervention plan? Some students do and some students don't. It's just very specific, and that's really the team deciding what is needed for that child. The next question looks at limited English proficiency, and there we're looking at the language needs of children. And if we feel that they need additional services, then again, we can document that in supplemental aids and services as well. That third question talks about Braille, so we're going to indicate if a child has a visual impairment and if they require instruction in Braille. That fourth area looks at communication. So in this area, we're really asking our speech and language pathologist to document if there's a concern in communication. And then that second part to this section talks about if the student requires deaf and hard of hearing services. And then that last part is assistive technology. And here in Wisconsin, now we're looking at two different parts of this. So we're asking ourselves, is this a child that requires assistive technology? And as many of you know, assistive technology can be many different things. It could be a communication app. It could be a switch. It could be something as a weighted pencil or a grip. It could be having access to different types of seating. It can really look different. But then along with that, we're asking the question about, does the student need things such as speech to text or text to speech in order to be able to access literacy? So that's something new that Wisconsin is looking at now. So we are really taking a further look at, does the child need assistive technology? And then if so, do they need it to access their education in that area of literacy? All right, we can go on. So disability-related needs, as I said earlier, is really the heart of that IEP, because while disability-related needs can change from year to year, it really drives what we need to do as a special education team so that we're meeting the needs of the student. So in our district, and we have started to implement this STEM. So Lisa, you probably have seen a change in how Riker's IEPs have looked from the beginning of the year to now. So what we're really doing here is that we're looking at the specifics of what the student needs. So you will see something, so you can see the examples below, but we're looking at a skill that needs to be developed, improved, increased, used, or learned in a specific area, and that's related to that root cause, so that the student can access, engage, or progress. So the examples that we gave were that the student needs to increase his addition and subtraction fact fluency so that he is able to solve grade level math problems, where in the past we may have wrote something like math calculation. So while that means something to us as educators, it wasn't really as clear to everyone what was the skill that we wanted to really focus on. So this gives much more detail and is very specific to what we're trying to improve. Again, you'll see that second example. So the student needs to improve his ability to initiate and respond to greetings so he can engage in healthy social interaction with teachers and peers. So that really drives the skill, so that later on when we write those goals, we're looking at what is the disability related need and then writing that goal to correspond to that. So here's just some more information about disability related needs. So in our IEP paperwork, it just talks about how it addresses the effect of the student's disability on access, engagement, and progress in the general education curriculum. It addresses the root cause of why a student is not meeting that standard and the functional expectations. And it talks about that skill or behavior that the student needs to develop to improve so that we can meet the age and grade level standards and expectations. All right, yep, we can go on. All right, so parent concerns and family engagement. We've talked a bit about this, but I think that this is just so important for families because you know your child best and we really want to hear your voice. So again, as I suggested, and I had been an early childhood teacher for a very long time and then taught older grades prior to that, but moving into that early childhood role, I really just saw the importance as families were just learning this process. It's scary, right? There's lots of big feelings. So just having parents being able to document and then guiding them through this process is so important. So just thinking about what are the things that you want us to know about your child? What are their strengths? What are your hopes for them? What are you worried about? So that we can put that into the IEP. And then family engagement is just so important. So what are we going to do as school staff to engage parents and families in the education of their student? So your district has set things that they're asking you to, or asking their staff to have in the IEP, but we really are wanting to think about what do you need for your child in order to have that family engagement, because we know when families are engaged, we're going to see more progress with students. All right. Then the next part of the IEP asks that we look at the goals that were written previously, because we always want to be sharing progress reports with families so that you know what is the progress that your child has made throughout the year. And then we have to determine, was the goal met? And if it was met, we are going to put data in there to describe how it was met. And if it wasn't met, you're still going to see that data, but then you're going to have a kind of what a plan is for what are we going to do differently, or what new goal will be written. So we really want to be accountable for the goals that we have met. We want them to be reasonable, and we want to have high expectations for students, and we want them to meet those goals. So that's really the purpose of this goal review, is it helps us to be accountable, and it lets you know as families that, yeah, we're thinking about this, and then we're thinking based on the information learned from the goal review, what are those next steps for that child? All right, and then we get to that developing annual goals. So when we're thinking about those annual goals, we're really looking at those disability related needs, because that's going to drive the goals. So we're thinking about academics, those functional and social skills, and really for us, we're thinking a lot about those social emotional competencies when we think about this. And that's what's really driving our annual goals. We want students to grow and achieve. We want them to be successful. And what we're thinking about is what is it going to look like over that annual IEP when we write that goal? Like, what is the progress that we can expect? So we have a statement in here about how goals are SMART, which means that they're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're realistic, and they're time bound. So it's important that we have a way to measure the goal. And I think also it's important, I had the opportunity to be in LEA yesterday at a meeting, but just explaining to the parent that you should be able to pick up this IEP. And if for some reason you move tomorrow, not that we want the parent to move, but if that happens, that new school district should be able to pick up that IEP, be able to read the goal and understand what it is that we're asking them to work on. So we want to make sure that it's clear and it can be understood by anyone that picks it up. And then also, really a very important part is progress monitoring. So you'll notice on those annual goal pages, we have to talk to you about how are we going to monitor this goal? How are we going to know that your child is making the progress that we're expecting? So you might see different things in there that will show that, whether it's documented observations or charting. The list can go on, but we have to have a way to do that so that when we get to this IEP each quarter or trimester, depending on how your school district is set up, that we can report on the progress and then determine was the goal met. So that's important as well. All right, well, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel and she is going to continue on.
So at this point in the IEP, you would have went through lots of information. So kind of those first few steps that Denise talked about, starting with the strengths, the present levels, identifying the disability related needs, reviewing the previous year's goals, and then crafting new goals, as well as determining how you're going to progress monitor the goals. So now that you've done all that foundational work, you're at a place where you can talk about what type of services does my child need? Does this student need? And it really boils down to 4 main services. The purpose of these services is to help that child advance towards those annual goals. We wrote those goals, we're progress monitoring them. We believe that they're important for the child and we want the child to meet those goals. So that is one main purpose. The other part is for them to make progress in the general education curriculum. So in our district, the vast majority of students are engaged in the general education curriculum and engaged in general education environments. About 1% of our population of students with IEPs are on an alternative curriculum. And in our state, we actually have guidelines around that. That's an indicator that is monitored, that we don't go over that, because it's this belief that we can get the majority of our students to make progress in that general education curriculum and to participate in non-academic activities. So that might be extracurricular activities, it may be clubs. And then above all, this is that standard that is put in place by IDEA, is that students are able to be educated and participate in environments where all children would receive that education. So ensuring a free, appropriate, and public education. We're going to talk through next the 4 main types of services. So the first one that we start with would be supplementary aids and services. So I like to think about this section as accommodations and modifications for the most part. So we're accommodating the student somehow. So same expectations, same standard as every other student, but we're putting in place some accommodations to help that child get to that goalpost, get to that standard. The other things we may see in this section of the IEP would be modifications. So how we're modifying the content, potentially modifying the environment, or our methodology for getting the students to the learning objective. So these are some examples of things we may write in. So we may say something like, again, this would be an accommodation, breaking down instructions and directions in clear, concise steps. We may say something like supplementing verbal instructions with visual support. So we're going to give verbal instruction, but we're also going to give a visual support as well. It may be something like using behavior management techniques. If a student has a behavior intervention plan, we may see that notated here. If a student has assistive technology, we may see that notated in this section of the IEP, supplementary aids and services. This is what it looks like in the state of Wisconsin. So you can see that we're describing exactly what support or service the student is receiving. We're going to tell you in the whole team, everybody that's supporting your child, our student, the frequency and the amount of time it will take to deliver this service. We're also going to provide the location in which it is taking place. So again, using that principle of least restrictive environment, we're hoping that the majority of the supports are taking place in a regular education environment. However, we know there are times where it needs to be a special education location. So it'll oftentimes say special education or regular education in this location section. Oftentimes, the duration is going to be the duration of that annual IEP, unless that service needs to be time bound for some reason. In our state, and this is a new addition, we actually have to say, why are we putting this service in the IEP? It is to address this goal. So we're providing this service to help the child accomplish this goal, and it's tied to this disability related need. This section of the IEP, it's important to note that all staff that work with the student are responsible for it. So your child's classroom teacher, specials teacher, so gym and art, the special education teacher, paraprofessionals, the principal, everybody that has contact with your child has a responsibility to help deliver these services. The next part of the IEP is specially designed instruction. So without this, there is no IEP. So this is why a student would have an IEP. It is because we went through that process. We've identified the child as a child with a disability using the criteria in our state. So they've met criteria in a specific area, and now we're saying that that child needs special education services, and we're going to provide it as specially designed instruction. So with that being said, what specially designed instruction is, it is us adapting the content, so what the child's learning, the methodology, so those are the strategies that we're using, and the delivery, so how we're delivering the instruction to the child. So a special education teacher is a person that is helping to adapt this for that student, and hopefully in collaboration with the classroom teacher, they're helping to carry that out. So this is actually from the legal guidance. So SEI is instruction in which the content, methodology, or delivery of the instruction is individualized. I added in adapted because that's what the special education teacher is doing, to address a student's disability related needs so that that student can access, engage, and make progress in the general education curriculum. And I'm going to throw in there and towards their IEP goals. So it's a service, it's not a place, and it can be provided in any environment. And then this is what it looks like in our IEPs in Wisconsin. So just like we went through for supplementary aids and services, you're going to have a description of what it is. Oftentimes it'll say something like specially designed instruction in ELA, or in comprehension skills, or in math calculation skills, or in social emotional behavioral skills. There's going to be a description of exactly what that service is, how much time it takes to deliver that service, and how often it's happening. So it may say something like 20 minutes 2 times a week, or 20 minutes 5 times a week. Again, we're going to say what the location is. Is this happening in a classroom, a general education classroom, which would be regular education, or are we pulling the child out and taking them to a special education location, or is that special education teacher kind of in there creating that special education location? And then duration, oftentimes that is the IEP period, so that annual period through which the IEP runs. We also notate the goal that it is addressing. And going back to that principle of least restrictive environment, that is the goal of the services, is that they're always happening in the least restrictive environment where the child's going to have the most access to their classroom and that general education curriculum. All right. And then the next part is related services. So if a student has specially designed instruction, sometimes we as IEP teams, we determine that that child also needs a related service. So this is typically done as part of the initial evaluation process. We wouldn't just say add on a related service outside of transportation at an annual IEP without some testing and without a person who is going to be able to deliver that service at the IEP. We just bolded some of the more common services that we see students receiving. So that might be speech therapy service, OT or occupational therapy, physical therapy, and sometimes if a student has health-related needs, there may be some nursing service in there. And we didn't highlight transportation, but sometimes a student may need transportation. This all goes back to they have a disability-related need, they're receiving STI, and then in order for them to benefit from their special education services, they need this related service in addition. So that's what this service would be. So this is the third service. This is what it looks like in our IEP. We just kind of listed out all of the potential things that a student could receive as a related service, knowing that some are much more common than others. And I would say that it's really going to come down to your districts and your district's capacity to offer that service if the student needs it. The third section or the third service is really about how do we modify the program if there's a need to it for it, and then how do we put supports in place for the school personnel. So that might be something like a training. In our district, our school nurse may provide a beginning of the year training for paraprofessionals, special education teachers, school staff around a specific need. So you may see that in this section of the IEP. There could be time written in for collaboration between regular education, the classroom teacher, and that special education teacher, or even sometimes a service provider and the staff. We're just documenting the fact that there is some collaboration going on, and we're sharing information about that student's program. One other thing that may happen is sometimes a related service provider might start with the consult. So it may not be in related services, but it may be some type of consult. Oftentimes we're seeing that when we're fading off a related service and actually starting to see some generalization of the skills that the student is developing as a result of that related service. And then, I think that was our last service, was it? Yeah, it was. Sorry, that went really fast. So this was the last service, the fourth service. And for all the services, we're describing it, we're sharing the frequency, amount, location, duration, and then how does this connect back to that disability related need, and how is it going to help that student make progress towards their IEP goal? The last thing is placement. So this is where we make that final decision around where services will be provided for your child. So oftentimes it'll say the school district, it'll say the location, meaning like the school in which it is to be provided. And then it'll oftentimes say dates. We actually have a screenshot in the next one to kind of lay that out a little bit. But in the end, it's this commitment to ensure that the student is receiving a free, appropriate public education, that is happening in a least restrictive environment. And we're taking into consideration the continuum of special education services that are available in the district as far as placements and options. So I just wanted to kind of point to two things, and maybe the IEP paperwork in your state looks a little different. It may even actually look like this, we use a program that we call Infinite Campus in our school districts. But above all, what's important is that this first section right here is when it says that the parents provided with notice of placement, prior written notice is a foundational piece of special education. And basically it's before anything happens with your child when it comes to special education services, like you consenting to services, us conducting assessments, us making changes to services, that you have notice of that. So once you've had your annual IEP meeting, as a practice in our district, we'll oftentimes say, we're going to get you the finalized paperwork by this day. You're going to have a couple of days to review it. And then we're going to start your special education services on this day. So this notice of placement is the date that the parent should have the finalized copy of the IEP in their hand. We also figure in mail and delivery because it's important that you have an opportunity to review this, make sure that everything we discuss made it into the IEP paperwork before we actually start to implement those new services. So this is the second section that we just want to bring your attention to, is that there should be an implementation date. So the date by which the services will start. So with that, we kind of walk you through what that annual IEP development process looks like. The last thing we wanted to share before we open it up for questions is just, what do you do if you went through this process and some type of dispute or conflict arises? I deal with this very often. When it gets to my desk, most of the time, families have worked through their case manager, they work through their principal, they work through Denise and program support, and now it's landing on my desk for some reason. I usually pause and I really try to think about, why is this conflict, dispute, concern arising in the first place? It oftentimes is related to one of three things. It could be the what of the conflict, right? So maybe connected to the related services or the special education services that the child's receiving, and the family feels like something else is needed, or the school feels like something else is needed, and it's really about the what. It could be about the how. So maybe as far as the services go, everything's solid and the students making progress, but maybe there was a lack of communication, or it's how somebody said something, or someone sent an email instead of picking up a phone. And now, because of that process piece, we have a dispute that has arisen. The other potential way that conflicts arise, in my experience, is it's about the who. So somehow wires got crossed. It could be a personality difference. It could be a communication style. It could be a tone of voice, or not using that active listening skills. And now we have some type of dispute. So for me, it's important to kind of understand, like, why is the dispute arising? But then oftentimes when I'm talking to families, I'm really trying to understand their position. So what are you hoping as an outcome once we work through this? Because I feel pretty confident that we're going to be able to work through this and figure it out. So if that happens, one thing that we encourage our families to always do is talk directly to the case manager, the service provider, or the principal. And I do this because I recognize that I'm sitting in a district office. The case manager is the one that you work with every day, who knows your child the best. They have the expertise, they have the knowledge, they have the data. You have your position, your expertise, your knowledge, your advocacy as a parent. So my goal is to get the two parties together to be able to talk through any concern. If for some reason that's not working, then as we said earlier, you always have that right to request an IEP meeting so we can get the IEP team together, because if it's related to the IEP services, disability related needs, IEP goals, that is something that's going to happen in the context of a team anyhow. So we would then encourage you to request an IEP team meeting and get everyone around the table to talk about how to work through it. The next step in our district is that you contact the director of special education or pupil services. If you work through these channels and you're still not able to get the outcome that you're looking for. And like I said, I kind of told you a little bit about my process. I'm trying to understand, why is the dispute arising? Is it the what? Is it the who? Is it the how? And then what are the positions? So what are you looking for as an outcome? If that doesn't work, we always encourage families to, I'm here, I'm gonna always try to make sure you understand your rights. I'm gonna listen to your position, but you can always reach out to an advocate as well. And in our state, we have really great parent organizations, and they partner with the school districts and the family to try to work through things. We also have a wonderful mediation system that helps with facilitated IEPs and mediation. A facilitated IEP is basically an IEP like any other one, but there's someone who's coming in as a facilitator and they're helping to talk through the concerns, right? They're not going to kind of make decisions on whether something's appropriate or not in IEP. They're really there to help facilitate conversation and discussion around the IEP. And then the other option is mediation. So like I said, in our state, we've had great success. I have personally used mediation with families, and we've had positive outcomes. And that's really to mediate parts of the IEP. So sometimes what happens is there could end up being a mediation agreement as a result of that. We hope it never gets there, right? We have all these things put in place to never get to this place, but sometimes it does. And then as a final resort, I know in our state, we have a state complaint process, which if a complaint goes through, it oftentimes results in some type of corrective action. If the district needs support around part of the process that maybe was not handled appropriately, then the district would receive a corrective action, and we will work to put some things in place, not only for that individual system or student, but it could also be for the system around improving practices for a school district. And then as an absolute last resort, we have due process, where families could potentially appeal to a hearing officer to hear the case and hear kind of what some of the concerns are, and help the family in the school district arrive at a solution around what's best for the student. So with that, we have kind of worked through the information that we have prepared for you this afternoon. I will take off the screen, and if there are any questions, we can use the last couple of minutes that we have reserved for this afternoon to answer questions you may have. That's okay, Crystal.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, thank you both so much for the information. It's very informative, and as an experienced IEP parent, I would say that it was very helpful. I wish I had a similar session when I started this journey with my 13-year-old son. So I'll hand it over to the participants and ask if anyone has a question. And if you're not comfortable asking, you can always put that in the chat and I can read that. Before we do, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And